He was just a struggling single dad fixing broken engines in a quiet little town, barely holding his own life together after loss. She was a woman on the run, clutching her injured child, showing up out of nowhere on a cold autumn night. He didn't ask questions. He simply opened the door. What happened next wasn't a miracle. It was something better. A story of kindness, healing, and the kind of love that finds you when you're no longer looking. Before we begin, if stories like this touch something deep in your heart, if you believe in second chances, quiet heroes, and the unexpected beauty of everyday goodness, then you're in the right place. Subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt stories like this, and let yourself be reminded that even small acts of kindness can change lives in the most extraordinary ways. Now let's begin. Struggling single dad took in a woman and her injured son. The next day, SUVs arrived at his house. The town of Millersville was the kind of place where the trees changed color before the people ever did. Come October, the maples blazed gold and crimson. The mornings carried the scent of wood smoke, and every porch had a carved pumpkin grinning through the fog. Dan Foster liked the quiet that came with autumn, the way the wind rustled through the leaves just enough to remind you time was moving, but not fast enough to panic. At 39, Dan had aged in a way that didn't show much on his face, but lived deep in his shoulders. Life had taken its toll not through scandal or bad decisions, just the long erosion of grief, hard work, and being the only person left holding it all together. He ran a modest auto repair shop at the edge of town and raised his daughter Ellie in a small cedar house just off Holloway Lane. It had been 2 years since he'd buried his wife. Some wounds don't scab, they simply learn how to ache quieter. That evening, he was late picking Ellie up from her after-school art program. The shop had been a mess. Someone's truck wouldn't start, and the distributor cap had practically fused to the engine. By the time he closed up and wiped the grease off his hands, the sun had started its slow descent, casting long shadows across the back roads. "Sorry, Pumpkin," he muttered as he climbed into his old Ford with a thermos of lukewarm coffee and an apple he wouldn't eat. Ellie didn't mind. She never did. She had her sketch pad and her thoughts and a soul so gentle it made Dan feel unworthy some days. She was waiting on the porch steps of the school, kicking her little boots together, humming something off-key. When she saw him, she waved like he was a hero returning from war. "Hi, Daddy," she chirped, hopping into the truck with her backpack and a painting of a bear holding a balloon. "You always paint animals with balloons," he teased, starting the engine. "Because animals need hope too," she said with complete seriousness, and Dan felt something shift behind his ribs. They were halfway home, the sky darkening fast, and mist rolling off the edge of the woods when he saw her. A woman, standing on the side of the road, arms wrapped tightly around a boy who looked no older than Ellie. The boy was limping. No, he wasn't walking at all, just sagging against her one shoe, missing his socks, soaked and muddy. Her coat was too thin for the weather hair clinging to her face from the drizzle that had started falling without warning. Dan slowed instinctively, then stopped. "Daddy," Ellie whispered, "is she okay?" "I don't know." He set his hand already on the door handle. "Stay in the truck, sweetheart." He stepped out, his boots crunching wet gravel. "Ma'am, you all right?" The woman turned, startled. Her eyes were dark, wary. She clutched the boy tighter. "We're fine," she said quickly, but the strain in her voice betrayed her. The boy whimpered softly. Dan looked at the kid's ankle. Swollen. Not broken, but he wasn't walking anywhere soon. "You're not fine," he said gently. "That boy needs to get warm off that foot. There's a clinic 10 minutes from here, but they're closed now. I live 5 minutes up. We've got a couch, hot soup, and a first aid kit." She shook her head. "We can't intrude." "It's not intruding. It's help." The woman hesitated. Her eyes flicked to the truck, where Ellie was now pressing her face to the window, watching them both. The woman's grip on the boy loosened slightly. "My name's Dan," he said. "That's my daughter Ellie. She'll talk your ear off, but she's harmless." The woman took a long breath. "I'm Grace," she murmured. "This is Leo." Leo didn't say anything, just stared at Dan like a wounded animal might, fearful, but too tired to flee. "Come on," Dan said. "Let's get you inside." 15 minutes later, they were in Dan's small living room. Grace sat stiffly on the edge of the couch, eyes scanning the room, as if it might shift into something dangerous. Leo lay curled beneath Ellie's favorite blanket foot, propped up on a pillow, while Ellie offered him her stuffed raccoon so he wouldn't be lonely. Dan knelt beside Leo, gently wrapping the ankle with a cloth bandage. Doesn't feel broken, he said. But you'll want to stay off it. Ice'll help. Grace looked down at her son, then up at Dan. Her eyes were less guarded now, but not by much. Thank you, she said, and Dan heard something in her voice that sounded like surprise. Not gratitude, a surprise that someone might care. I made soup, Ellie announced from the kitchen, her nose barely clearing the counter. You helped open the can, Dan corrected, chuckling. Same thing. Dinner was a quiet affair. 2 bowls of tomato soup, 1 grilled cheese sandwich split in half, and saltines in a chipped bowl. Ellie chattered between bites. Leo didn't speak at all, but his hand stayed clenched around the raccoon. Grace ate slowly, like someone unaccustomed to being fed. When the dishes were done and the kids tucked into makeshift beds on the living room floor, Dan poured 2 cups of tea. He handed one to Grace and leaned against the counter across from her. You don't have to tell me anything, he said. But if you need a ride somewhere tomorrow, I can take you. No questions asked. Grace looked down into the tea like it might give her answers. Thank you, she said again. Then after a pause, it's been a long time since anyone offered anything without asking for something first. Dan didn't reply. He didn't need to. The clock ticked gently in the kitchen. Outside, the wind sighed through the trees. And for the first time in years, the house didn't feel quite so hollow. The next morning arrived with the scent of pine and wood smoke drifting through the cracked window in the living room. Golden light pooled across the floorboards, inching toward the blankets where 2 small figures still slept. Ellie was sprawled on her back, one arm tossed over her stuffed raccoon, her soft breaths a quiet rhythm. Beside her, Leo lay curled into himself, his brow furrowed, even in sleep, as if fighting off dreams he hadn't invited. Dan stood in the kitchen, quietly scrambling eggs in a cast-iron skillet. He didn't usually cook breakfast on weekdays. Ellie was a cereal and milk kind of kid, but something about having guests, especially ones who arrived under such strange circumstances, stirred a sense of duty in him that went beyond manners. It wasn't about being polite. It was about dignity. If someone came through your door, hurt and cold, you fed them. He glanced toward the hallway where Grace had taken the guest room. The door was still closed. She hadn't said much the night before, only the basics. Her name, Leo's, and a quiet thank you that felt like it had to crawl over years of silence to reach her lips. Dan didn't push her. He wasn't a man who demanded stories. If there was one thing life had taught him, it was that people would tell you what they needed when they were ready, and sometimes the telling mattered less than the staying. He plated 2 servings of eggs and toast, poured a cup of weak coffee for himself, and set Ellie's juice glass on the table. Just as he was cutting fruit, he heard the soft creak of the guest room door. Grace stepped into the kitchen, one hand still smoothing the wrinkles from her borrowed flannel shirt. Good morning, Dan said without turning. She looked at the food, then at him as though unsure if it was real. I hope eggs are okay. They're fine, she said, her voice low but clearer than last night. You didn't have to. I know, he interrupted gently. But it's breakfast. And you're here. She nodded slowly, then almost reluctantly sat at the table. There was silence between them, but not the kind that strained. It was the silence of 2 people measuring each other across a chasm of the unknown, where trust wasn't given, but cautiously offered in pieces. Leo's still asleep, she said, as if needing to offer something in return. So's Ellie, Dan replied. She doesn't usually sleep that well. Nightmares sometimes. Grace looked up. Same with Leo. Dan nodded, resting his hands on the back of a chair. How old is he, 7? He's small for his age. He's tough, Dan said. Didn't make a sound when I wrapped that ankle. Grace gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. He's been through a lot. Dan didn't ask what she meant. Instead, he set a folded piece of paper in front of her, a map of the town, and a list of resources, shelters, clinics, even the local library. In case you need options, he said. It's not much, but it's something. Grace stared at the paper. Her fingers trembled just slightly as she picked it up. Thank you, she whispered. You don't even know us. I don't need to. She met his eyes then, and for a long moment Dan saw something flicker there. Not fear exactly, not even sadness. Something deeper, the kind of tired that lived in the bones, the kind of weariness that came from being seen too much by the wrong people and not enough by the right ones. Before either of them could say more, there was a sudden thud from the living room. Leo was sitting upright, blinking in confusion, one leg stuck awkwardly under the blanket. Ellie, already awake, scrambled to her feet. "Don't move," she cried. "Your ankle." Leo looked down, dazed. "Where? Where are we?" Dan knelt beside him, voice calm. "You're safe. You're in my house. We brought you here last night because your foot needed rest." "You remember?" Leo blinked again, then nodded. Grace rushed over and sat beside him, brushing his hair from his eyes. "It's okay, sweetheart. We're safe. Just for a little while." Leo didn't say anything. He only looked at Ellie, who held out the raccoon with both hands. "You dropped him." Leo took it wordlessly and hugged it to his chest. Later that morning, Dan drove into town to pick up a proper ankle brace and some children's pain reliever. Grace had insisted he didn't need to, but he waved her off. When he returned, the house was quiet except for the soft sound of Ellie reading aloud. Dan stood for a moment in the doorway to the living room and listened. And the bear said, "I thought I was alone in this forest, but then I found your balloon." Ellie turned the page, then looked up at Leo. "Do you want to pick the next one?" Leo didn't answer, but he scooted closer. Dan smiled and stepped back into the kitchen where Grace was rinsing the mugs in the sink. "You didn't have to do the dishes," he said. She shrugged. "I needed something to do." "You're welcome to stay another night, if you want." Grace's shoulders tensed. "Dan, I don't want to cause trouble. You don't know who I am. I know you're a mother. I know your son's hurt. And I know you didn't ask for a thing last night." Grace turned, drying her hands on a towel. "Most people want to know why. Why we're here. Where we came from." "I'm not most people." She studied him again, this man in a faded gray t-shirt, jeans, stained with grease, a quiet strength in the way he filled his own space without pressing into hers. For the first time, she let her guard down just an inch. "We're running from something," she said softly. "From someone." Dan didn't ask who. He just nodded and poured her a fresh cup of coffee. "You've got a place here," he said simply, "for as long as you need it." Grace blinked hard, and for a second she looked like she might cry but didn't. She only reached for the mug fingers brushing his and whispered, "Thank you." In that small, unremarkable kitchen with mismatched mugs and peeling linoleum, something began to shift. Not dramatically, not loudly, but it shifted nonetheless. Sometimes home wasn't a place you returned to. It was a place that waited quietly to be made. That evening, the wind picked up, rustling the pines behind Dan's house and stirring leaves across the porch like restless children. Inside, the small living room glowed with the soft amber light of a standing lamp. The old furnace hummed gently, and a pot of soup simmered on the stove, filling the air with the scent of carrots, thyme, and something almost like comfort. Dan stood at the kitchen counter slicing bread with a quiet focus that masked the tangle of thoughts running through his mind. Grace and Leo had been there barely 24 hours, and yet the atmosphere in his house felt subtly different, warmer, fuller, as if the silence had learned to exhale. Behind him, Leo sat propped on the couch with Ellie beside him, both kids wrapped in mismatched blankets. Ellie was holding a book in her lap, reading aloud with all the gravity of a schoolteacher. Every few sentences, she paused to explain a big word to Leo, who listened attentively, but still said little. That didn't seem to matter to Ellie. She talked enough for both of them. Grace, meanwhile, stood at the sink washing a few dishes, left over from lunch. She had insisted gently but firmly, and Dan hadn't argued. There was something in her that needed the small order of doing something with her hands. A rhythm, a purpose. Dan cleared his throat softly. "Soup's almost done." Grace looked over her shoulder and nodded. "Smells incredible." He offered a small half-smile. "Don't get your hopes up. It's mostly canned stuff and wishful thinking." She allowed a flicker of amusement to pass across her face. "Well, your wishful thinking beats anything I've cooked lately. You strike me as someone who knows her way around a kitchen." Her hand hesitated on a plate. "I used to," she said quietly. Dan didn't push. He only turned back to the stove and began ladling the soup into bowls. There were three, the only matching set he owned. For a moment he stared at them, unsure. Then he opened the cupboard, pulled out a fourth, and set it beside the others. At the table, the kids clambered into their chairs with the clumsy enthusiasm only children have. Leo sat close to Ellie but didn't make eye contact. Ellie chatted as she unfolded her napkin. Grace approached slowly, wiping her hands on a dish towel. When she saw the fourth bowl, she paused. Dan looked up. "You hungry?" She nodded once, then took the seat across from him. They began to eat. The first few minutes were quiet, filled only with the clink of spoons and occasional slurps. Ellie swung her legs under the table and peppered Leo with soft questions: his favorite color, his favorite dinosaur, whether he liked peanut butter. He answered a few in near whispers, but something about her curiosity softened him. Soon he was leaning in to hear her better, his spoon forgotten. Grace watched them with a complicated look, equal parts gratitude and grief. Dan saw it. He didn't name it. Instead, he asked gently, "You two on your way to somewhere specific?" Grace looked at him, then down at her bowl. "We were," she said, "but plans changed." Dan nodded. "Well, this town isn't much, but it's got good people, and the coffee's decent if you know where to look." She smiled faintly. "Do you always bring strangers into your home?" "No," he said, "only the ones with brave little boys and mystery in their eyes." Grace's smile widened a fraction, then fell just as quickly. "I'm not running a scam, Dan," she said, her voice suddenly sharper. "I'm not here to take advantage of your kindness. I know that. You don't even know who I am. I don't need to. I know enough." "Do you?" He met her gaze steady and unflinching. "You're someone who protects her kid. Someone who doesn't ask for help unless she's cornered. Someone who doesn't trust easily, but still says thank you when it counts. That's enough for me." Grace swallowed hard, then looked away, blinking fast. She reached for her water glass and took a sip to steady herself. Leo, unaware of the tension, suddenly spoke up. "Miss Ellie said I can sleep with her raccoon tonight." Dan glanced at his daughter. She offered. Ellie nodded solemnly. "He gets scared sometimes, and he doesn't snore. Leo can borrow him." Dan gave her a look. "Didn't you say last week that raccoon was your most precious nighttime companion?" "I can share," she said with a shrug. "You told me that's what good people do." Dan's heart caught in his throat. Grace looked down at her son, eyes glistening. After dinner, the kids returned to their blanket fort on the floor. Dan cleaned up the table while Grace quietly dried dishes again. The rhythm between them was almost domestic, and it scared her more than she expected. She broke the silence. "You shouldn't get used to us being here." Dan wiped a dish. "Why not? Because we won't stay. We can't." He turned to her, leaning his weight on the counter. "Is someone looking for you?" She hesitated. "You don't have to tell me. Not now. But if someone's after you, if you're in danger, I need to know." Grace looked away. "It's complicated." Dan nodded slowly. "Most things worth protecting are." She didn't respond, but she didn't walk away either. Later that night, as the kids drifted into sleep under their blanket, Fort Dan sat on the porch steps, coffee cup in hand, watching the stars try to punch through a thick veil of clouds. The night was colder now, the kind that made you pull your jacket tighter and your thoughts closer. He didn't know what Grace and Leo were really running from, but he knew this much: the house had been empty too long. And something about that woman and the quiet boy who hadn't smiled until Ellie handed him a raccoon made the place feel like home again, if only for a little while. The morning began with the low rumble of tires crunching gravel, an unfamiliar sound on Holloway Lane, where the loudest thing most days was the creak of Dan's porch swing or the occasional deer rustling through brush. Dan had just stepped out to check the mailbox when he heard it: 3 large black SUVs gliding slowly down the road, windows tinted, moving with the precision of a funeral procession. He froze, squinting toward the tree line. These weren't local vehicles. Too polished. Too uniform. Something in his gut turned cold. Inside the house, Grace was folding the blanket Leo had used the night before. The boy was still asleep, one arm flung across Ellie's raccoon. The children's breathing filled the silence like a lullaby. Dan re-entered the house and locked the door behind him. "Grace," he said quietly. She turned. His face told her everything. She didn't ask. She didn't need to. Instead, she moved faster than he'd seen her move before, straight to the kids. She knelt by Leo, smoothing his hair once, then stood and faced Dan. "They found us." "Who?" he asked, stepping closer. She shook her head. "Not here. Not now. You need to let them in." "Grace, I'm not letting. They won't hurt you," she said. "They're not here for you." Dan stared at her, trying to read between the panic in her eyes and the control in her voice. He opened his mouth to respond, but the knock came first, sharp, firm, authoritative. She drew a breath and opened the door herself. 3 men in black suits stood on the porch, their posture, crisp movements deliberate. Behind them, the SUVs idled. The tallest man spoke first, eyes flicking to Dan briefly before settling on Grace. Ms. Hathaway. Dan's eyes shifted to Grace. She didn't flinch. You've been gone 8 days, the man said. We're here to escort you and your son home. Dan's world tilted. Wait, Hathaway, he echoed. As in, Hathaway Industries. Grace finally looked at him. Her voice was low, steady. My family. Dan stepped back stunned. His mind raced. Hathaway Industries, one of the largest private conglomerates in the country. Real estate, technology, philanthropy, headlines, Fortune magazine. Grace, was that Hathaway? The suited man stepped forward. We appreciate your assistance in keeping Ms. Hathaway and her son safe. However, her presence is required immediately for security and legal matters. Grace held up a hand. Give me 5 minutes. The man hesitated. Ma'am, 5 minutes, she repeated. He stepped back without a word. Grace closed the door behind her and leaned against it for a moment. Then she looked at Dan. I'm sorry I didn't tell you. He ran a hand down his jaw, still trying to catch up. You're one of those Hathaways. I was, she said quietly. I left. Why? Because they were planning a future for Leo I couldn't accept. They don't see him as a boy. They see him as a legacy, a name, a deal to leverage. Her voice cracked. I had to get away. I didn't know where else to go. Dan exhaled hard and looked down the hallway where the children still slept. You could have told me. I didn't want to ruin it, she said. The quiet, the normal. I didn't want you to look at me like a story in a magazine. He looked up at her then, and she saw it. The flicker of hurt, not from betrayal, but from the distance she had kept between them. You stayed because you wanted Leo safe, he said. Grace nodded. And because. Maybe for a second it felt like home. She nodded again slower. Outside, the SUV still hummed. The men hadn't moved. What happens now, he asked. I have to go, she said. If I don't, they'll keep looking. And the longer I run, the harder it'll be for Leo. She turned her eyes to his. But I'll never forget what you did for us. Dan's throat tightened. Grace moved past him and went to wake Leo. Ellie stirred too, her curls, messy eyes squinting in the morning light. You're leaving, she asked, voice small. Leo nodded, not meeting her eyes. Ellie pulled the raccoon from her blanket and pushed it gently into his hands. He's for you now, she said. Dan stood in the doorway as Grace led Leo outside. The suited men stepped aside and she helped her son into the back seat. Then she paused and turned. One final look. Dan raised his hand in a quiet wave. Grace touched her heart. The SUVs pulled away. And just like that, the house was quiet again. Too quiet. That evening, Dan sat on the porch, mug of coffee going cold in his hand. Ellie sat beside him, kicking her legs, a sketchbook in her lap. She was drawing again. A house, 4 stick figures, a raccoon. Are they coming back? She asked. Dan didn't answer for a long time. Then he said, I don't know, sweetheart. She looked up at him. I hope they do. Dan looked out at the road where the taillights had disappeared that morning. So did he. The house hadn't changed, but everything inside it felt different. It had only been 2 days since the SUVs disappeared down Holloway Lane with Grace and Leo inside, but Dan could still hear the silence they left behind. It wasn't the peaceful, solitary kind he used to find comfort in. This was different, hollow, uneven, like something essential had been peeled away, leaving the rest of the house tilting to one side. He found himself standing in the living room more than once without remembering why, looking at the couch where Leo had rested his ankle at the blanket Ellie had insisted on lending him. The raccoon was gone, of course. Ellie had insisted Leo keep it. She said he looked like someone who needed a forever friend, Dan had told himself, trying to smile when he folded the blanket back into the linen chest. But the smile never made it to his eyes. Ellie had drawn 5 pictures of Leo since they left. Each one was taped to the fridge with care. In one, Leo was flying a kite. In another, he was building a fort made of pillows. In the last one, she'd drawn them all, her Dan, Grace, and Leo standing together under a big oak tree. She labeled it Our Autumn Day. Dan couldn't bring himself to take that one down. He'd always believed his life was meant to be quiet, stable, routine, that if he just kept his head down, worked hard, and did right by his daughter, that would be enough. But now he wasn't so sure. Late Wednesday afternoon, Dan stood outside the auto shop, wiping his hands on a rag as the last of the customers pulled away. He had replaced a radiator, rotated tires, and diagnosed an electrical issue all in a daze. He kept expecting to look up and see Grace walking down the gravel drive, Leo trailing behind her, maybe carrying one of Ellie's art kits. But there was no one, just wind and the hum of distant traffic. He leaned against the garage door, squinting at the clouds moving in. A storm was coming, the kind that crawled in quiet and then thundered when no one was ready. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text. From Ellie's teacher. Ellie was quiet today, seemed distracted. Just wanted you to know. Dan sighed. He wasn't surprised. When he picked her up that evening, Ellie climbed into the truck without a word. She clutched her sketchbook to her chest like it was a shield. You okay, Pumpkin? He asked gently as he started the engine. She shrugged. My stomach doesn't feel good. Dan knew that kind of ache, the kind medicine couldn't touch. At home, she sat at the table drawing, while Dan reheated leftover stew. When he set her bowl down, she didn't touch it. She just flipped her sketchbook closed and stared out the window. Do you think Leo got my letter? She asked quietly. Dan had almost forgotten Ellie had insisted on writing him a note the morning after they left. She drew a heart and wrote, You can come back when you feel better. I'm sure he did, Dan replied, and I bet it meant a lot to him. She nodded but didn't smile. Cause, if they're rich, maybe they don't get mail like us. Maybe they only get important grown-up letters. Dan sat across from her, resting his elbows on the table. I think the most important letters are the ones that come from kids who care. That earned him a half smile, the kind that took effort. After dinner, while Ellie took her bath, Dan wandered into the living room and stood by the window. Dusk had fallen, casting long shadows across the yard. The pine trees swayed with the wind, whispering secrets he couldn't hear. His gaze drifted to the small folded note on the windowsill. Grace had left it before she got in the SUV. He hadn't opened it right away, unsure why. Maybe he'd been afraid of what it might say or not say. Now he unfolded it carefully. Dan, I don't know how to thank you for what you gave us. It was only 2 nights, but it felt more like a pause in the chaos I didn't know I needed. You didn't ask questions and you didn't run when you found out the truth. That meant more than I can say. I don't know if or when we'll see you again, but please know that what you gave Leo, normalcy, friendship, safety, was a gift I could never repay. I hope you keep that porch light on, just in case. Grace. Dan let out a slow breath and folded the note, sliding it into the drawer beside the couch. He'd never been one for hope, not really. Hope to him had always felt like walking a tightrope without knowing if the other side was real. But somehow that note, those words felt different. They didn't promise anything, but they opened a door. And he realized he didn't need certainty. He just needed possibility. That night after Ellie fell asleep, Dan stayed up late fixing a wobbly leg on the kitchen table. The task didn't need to be done that night, but he did it anyway. Part of him wanting to keep his hands busy. The other part wondering what Grace might have thought of this odd little house if she'd stayed longer. The next morning he made pancakes for Ellie. She blinked in surprise. We never have pancakes on Thursdays. Dan smiled. Well, maybe today's special. Ellie chewed thoughtfully, like when Grace made us pancakes. Dan's hand paused on the syrup bottle. She looked up at him. Do you think she'll come back, Daddy? He took a breath, steady and quiet. I think sometimes people find their way back to the places they felt safe. Ellie nodded and took another bite. Later, as Dan washed the dishes, he looked out the kitchen window toward the long, empty road that curved behind the trees. He didn't know if he'd see her again, but he found himself hoping. And that he realized was something new. Something Grace had left behind, not in words or gestures, but in the air itself. Not an ending. Just a pause. Saturday came with a sharp chill, the kind that lingered in your bones, no matter how high the sun rose. Dan pulled his flannel tighter as he crossed the short distance from the house to the shop out back. The shop was quiet this time of morning. Tools lined up on the bench, the faint smell of motor oil clinging to the air like a familiar song. He needed the quiet today, the kind that let his hands work while his mind wandered. A carburetor sat in pieces in front of him, an old customer's 1987 Ford Ranger, waiting patiently in the corner bay. Dan worked with the same calm rhythm he always had, but his thoughts kept drifting to Grace, to Leo. To that moment the SUVs rolled away and took something with them he hadn't even realized he'd come to rely on. He hadn't heard from her. He didn't expect to. People like Grace Hathaway didn't exactly text on a whim or drop by with a casserole. Still, some part of him, an irrational, hopeful part, kept checking his phone, half expecting a message, a missed call, something. Instead, he got a knock. Not at the shop door, but at the front of the house. He wiped his hands, grabbed a rag, and walked out toward the porch, where Ellie was already peeking through the front curtain. "Daddy," she said in a whisper. "It's a fancy lady." Dan raised an eyebrow and stepped onto the porch. Standing there dressed in smart but understated business attire was a woman in her early 40s. Not Grace, not even close. Her hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and her expression was professional, almost unreadable. "Mr. Foster," she asked. He nodded cautiously. "That's me." She extended a hand. "I'm Margaret Whitmore. I work with the Hathaway family." Dan's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone even. "Is Grace all right?" "She's fine," the woman said quickly. "She asked me to deliver this personally." She handed him an envelope, thick ivory-colored, embossed with the Hathaway family crest. Dan stared at it without moving. Margaret hesitated. "There's also a gift. Something from the family." A small gesture of appreciation. Dan finally looked at her. Appreciation. She motioned toward the curb. Parked at the edge of his gravel drive was a brand new state-of-the-art truck. Midnight blue. Polished chrome. Windows so clean they reflected the sky. "It's yours," she said. "No strings attached." Grace didn't request this, the family did. Dan stared at the vehicle. He didn't move. Didn't blink. "May I ask a question, Ms. Whitmore?" "Of course. Do they always try to repay kindness with horsepower?" She blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me." Dan folded his arms, still holding the envelope. "I didn't take Grace in because I thought someone would buy me a new truck. I did it because she was cold, tired, and scared, and because her son was limping through a rainstorm." Margaret's expression shifted only slightly, but it was enough. A flicker of discomfort. "Maybe even shame. I understand," she said softly. "No, I don't think you do," Dan said, his voice low. "Your world operates on contracts and gifts and tokens of gratitude. Mine runs on something simpler. You help because someone needs it. Not because they're famous, not because there's something in it for you. Just because it's right." He looked at the truck again, then back at her. "Tell the family thanks," he said. "But I don't need it. What I got out of those 2 days can't be bought. And I think Grace knows that." Margaret nodded slowly, then extended her hand once more. "I'll pass your message along." Dan shook it. "Safe travels." She left without another word, the expensive shoes on her feet somehow sounding louder than they should have against the gravel. The SUV that brought her whisked her away, and the sleek new truck remained behind, idle and untouched. Dan stood on the porch a long time. Ellie joined him, hugging his leg. "Was that about Grace?" In a way, he murmured. "What's in the envelope?" He hadn't opened it yet. Now with her small eyes on him, he tore it gently. Inside was a letter, handwritten. "Then I didn't know my family would do that. I didn't ask for a truck or a messenger or any kind of thanks. I just wanted to say this in my own words, even if I couldn't find the right ones. I miss the quiet of your kitchen, the smell of your shop, the way Ellie made Leo laugh like he hadn't in months. I can't give you promises. Not yet. But I'm working toward a life I can be proud of, one I can choose, not one that was chosen for me. And if I get there, I hope you'll still have a place for us at your table." With more gratitude than I can say, Grace. Dan folded the letter and placed it gently in his back pocket. Ellie looked up at him. "Is she coming back?" "I don't know," he said honestly. "But I think she's trying." They stood together for a moment longer, the autumn breeze curling around them, rustling the pine needles and carrying with it a whisper of something hopeful. Then Ellie pointed to the new truck. "Can I at least sit in it before you give it back?" Dan laughed. "Yeah, kiddo. I think that's allowed." They walked toward it together, side by side, and behind them on the porch the envelope remained just a piece of paper, but somehow heavier than steel. The Saturday after Margaret Whitmore's visit passed with an eerie calm. Dan returned the truck on Monday morning, driving it 30 miles to the nearest Hathaway regional office and handing the keys to a stunned receptionist. He didn't ask for a receipt. He didn't wait for a thank you. He just walked back to the bus station, hands in his jacket pockets, and took the long way home. But something had changed since Grace left. Not the air, not the house, Dan himself. The space Grace and Leo had occupied hadn't just been physical, it had shifted the rhythm of his days, softened the corners of his routine. He missed the way Grace hovered near the sink like she didn't want to take up space, but couldn't help making it warmer. He missed the way Leo leaned into Ellie's stories even though he barely spoke. And above all, he missed the feeling that something unexpected and quietly beautiful was unfolding. Tuesday afternoon, Dan pulled a small package from the mailbox. No return address. Just his name written in a neat, looping script he recognized instantly. Inside was a soft children's book, The Bear and the Balloon. Ellie had read it to Leo that second night. Tucked inside the back cover was a single sentence written in pencil. Sometimes it takes a journey to know where you belong. Dan sat on the porch steps with the book in his lap, sunlight slanting through the trees. His fingers traced the edges of the worn pages. A story about a lonely bear who follows a red balloon across the forest, meeting animals who need help along the way. The bear keeps thinking he's chasing something for himself, but when he finally catches the balloon, it pops and he realizes he never needed it. He had already found his place in the act of helping. That evening, Ellie helped Dan pack lunches for the next day. She hummed as she worked, folding the napkins into clumsy triangles and carefully labeling each sandwich bag. "Do you think Leo reads the books I sent him?" she asked. Dan smiled gently. "I bet he does." "I think he's brave," she said, "but not the loud kind, the quiet kind like you." Dan swallowed the lump in his throat. "Yeah," he said softly, "the best kind." Ellie bit her lip. "If I keep drawing him pictures, do you think that's a way to help him not forget us?" "I think it's the perfect way," he said. "Sometimes the things we make with our hands are what stay in people's hearts the longest." On Wednesday, Dan took Ellie to the library after school. She darted toward the children's section while Dan lingered in the nonfiction aisle, pretending to browse while his mind wandered. The place was nearly empty the way small-town libraries usually are in late fall. The quiet was comforting, familiar, until he saw her, not Grace. A woman standing near the community board pinning a flyer with a trembling hand. She was young 20s, maybe wearing a thin sweater and jeans a size too big. Her eyes were red, her hair unbrushed, clutching the hand of a toddler who kept trying to reach for the donation jar beside the circulation desk. Dan didn't approach her. He didn't want to scare her. But he watched as the librarian, a sharp-tongued older woman named Mabel, spoke gently to the young mother, offered her a list of local shelters, even handed her a paper bag filled with snacks. And that was when Dan felt it again, that familiar pull low in the chest, like something asking to be answered. On the walk back to the truck, Ellie chattered about the 3 new books she'd borrowed, but Dan's thoughts lingered elsewhere. "Daddy?" she asked, tugging his sleeve. "Yeah, you're being quiet." He smiled down at her. "Just thinking. About the girl with the baby." He raised an eyebrow. "You saw her too." Ellie nodded. She looked like Grace. Dan blinked. She hadn't. Not really. But Ellie wasn't talking about appearances. She was talking about the weight in the woman's shoulders, the fear in her silence, the exhaustion of someone who had nowhere else to go. That night after Ellie went to bed, Dan pulled out a legal pad and started writing. It wasn't a letter. It wasn't even meant for Grace. It was a list. Ideas for a community garage night, free oil changes for single parents, partner with local food bank, invite library for kids' story corner, maybe get volunteers from the high school auto class. He stared at the list, tapping the pen. He didn't have wealth. He didn't have pedigree or power, but he had tools. He had time. And he had the memory of a woman standing on the side of the road clutching a child in the rain, and how everything changed because he stopped. Dan didn't know if Grace would ever come back, but what she'd left behind, her gratitude, her bravery, her story had planted something, not longing, not regret, purpose. 2 days later, Dan stood in the kitchen, sipping coffee when Ellie raced in from the porch, breathless. "There's a lady at the bakery," she panted. "Miss Carla said she looks like a movie star, but acts like a friend." Dan frowned. "What do you mean she's helping hand out cookies to the kids whose moms are in the shelter?" "She didn't say her name, but she has Leo's raccoon in her bag." Dan felt the cup slip slightly in his hand. He didn't run. He didn't rush. He just nodded, reached for his jacket, and told Ellie to put on her shoes. They walked down the block to the bakery, small, warm, packed with the scent of cinnamon and butter. And there, standing near a tray of sugar cookies, her sleeves rolled up, hair tied back, was Grace. No security, no press, just her. She turned at the sound of the bell. Their eyes met. No words, just breath. Then a slow, cautious smile. Grace stepped forward, not with apologies, not with grand declarations, but with the quiet certainty of someone who'd walked a long way to get back to where she belonged. Dan reached into his pocket. He didn't know why, but he still carried the note she left behind. And now he finally understood what she meant. Please keep the porch light on. She had seen it, and she'd come home. The bell above the bakery door jingled a second time, softer than the first, as Dan and Ellie stepped inside. Warmth hit them immediately: oven heat, sugar, cinnamon, vanilla. But that wasn't what made Dan's heart stop. It was the sight of Grace. She wore no makeup, no designer coat. Her sleeves were dusted with flour, her hair twisted in a loose knot like she hadn't looked in a mirror all day. And yet to Dan, she had never looked more beautiful. Grace met his eyes across the room, not with surprise, with recognition, a quiet knowing. She'd come to find them. Ellie didn't wait. She bolted forward, arms wide. Grace! Grace crouched just in time to catch her wrapping Ellie into a flowery embrace that made a few sugar cookies tumble from the tray beside them. She laughed, really laughed, and Dan heard in that sound the release of something long held too tightly. I missed you, Ellie whispered against her shoulder. I missed you more, Grace said, holding her close. Dan stood still, taking it all in the small, bright room full of children nibbling cookies, a few tired mothers sipping coffee in the corner. Grace smiling through tears, and something else, something unspoken. The feeling that this wasn't just a visit. This was a return. When Grace finally stood, Ellie clung to her side like ivy on a porch post. Dan took a few steps forward. You're here, he said. I am. How long? Her voice caught a little. As long as you'll let me be. He swallowed hard. That sounds like more than just a stopover. Grace looked around at the bakery, at the kids, at the modest faces full of struggle and strength. It's not a stopover anymore, she said. I think I've done enough running. Dan nodded slowly. What happened? She exhaled. After I left, the pressure came down hard. My father wanted me to go public, hold a press conference, assure investors I was back in control. She smiled faintly. I declined. Was that allowed? Grace laughed dryly. Not exactly. But the beauty of stepping down is that no one can fire you. Dan raised an eyebrow. You walked away. I handed over my shares to my brother, she said. He always wanted the power. Let him have it. Dan studied her. There was no bitterness in her tone, only clarity. I didn't want Leo growing up with nannies and boardrooms and whispered negotiations about his future, she continued. I wanted him to grow up with his future, not as someone else's idea of one. He nodded. And now I'm setting up something small, she said. A foundation, local, real, women and kids in crisis. I figured if someone hadn't opened their door to me when I needed it, I don't know where we'd be. Maybe I can be that door for someone else. Dan looked at her for a long moment. You already are. Grace's eyes glistened, but she didn't look away. A child tugged her sleeve. Grace turned briefly to help the little girl grab a cookie from the top of the tray. It was such a simple act, so instinctive, so unguarded, that Dan felt something tighten in his chest. She wasn't just passing through anymore. Later that afternoon, the three of them walked back to Dan's house together. Leo wasn't with her. He was at a local day program, but she assured them he'd be thrilled to see Ellie again. He carries that raccoon everywhere, she added with a smile. Even sleeps with it on his chest like a seatbelt. Ellie beamed. At home, Grace stepped inside slowly, like she was testing the shape of her own memory. Her eyes lingered on the corner where Leo had laid with his ankle propped, on the kitchen table where she'd once dried dishes, on the chair where Dan had sat quietly listening, never demanding more than she could give. Dan noticed. Every glance, every pause. Not much has changed, he said. She turned toward him. No, she said softly. But I have. He offered a small smile. Me too. They didn't speak for a moment, just stood in the quiet comfort of a space that no longer felt like his or hers, but somehow already theirs. Ellie tugged Grace's hand and pulled her toward the fridge. Look, she said, pointing at the drawings. Grace bent down, eyes widening. There were at least 6 of them now, crayon portraits of her, of Leo, of raccoons, of porch lights and stars. One showed all 4 of them standing under a tree with red and gold leaves. Across the top, Ellie had written in shaky but bold letters, "When we were all together." Grace brought a hand to her mouth, blinking back tears. "These are beautiful." Ellie grinned. "You can add one now." Grace turned to Dan. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," he replied. "You're here. That's enough." She hesitated. "I still don't know where I belong, Dan." "Not exactly. But this feels like a beginning." He nodded slowly. "Then let's start from here." That evening, Dan lit the old fireplace for the first time that season. The warmth spread quickly through the living room, mingling with the laughter of two children retelling stories about raccoons who drive trucks and bears who bake pies. Grace curled up in the armchair, a blanket around her knees, holding a cup of tea with both hands. Dan sat across from her, his elbows on his knees, watching the flames flicker. "I kept the porch light on," he said quietly. She smiled and her voice came back, just as soft. "I saw it." Outside, the leaves rustled gently under the moonlight. The road was still. The house, for the first time in a long while, didn't feel like it was waiting for something. It felt full. Grace wasn't just a visitor anymore. She was home. The following week moved differently, less like a routine, more like a rhythm. Not fast, not slow, just steady, measured, full of the kinds of small, meaningful things Dan hadn't realized he'd been missing. Grace and Leo didn't just blend into his and Ellie's lives. They reshaped them. Morning routines shifted, meals stretched longer. Laughter returned to corners of the house where it had long been quiet, and yet none of it felt forced. No one claimed space, they simply offered it, and the others stepped in. On Tuesday morning, Ellie stood in the hallway, brushing Leo's hair with a focus so intense Dan dared not interrupt. The little boy sat cross-legged on the rug, eyes on the raccoon in his lap, letting her fuss. "You have too many cowlicks," she muttered, frowning. "It's like brushing a porcupine." Leo gave a half smile. "Sorry, don't be," she said. "Porcupines are cool." Dan watched from the kitchen doorway, coffee in hand, heart tugging in that quiet way it did now every time he saw them together. It wasn't just that Leo trusted Ellie, it was the way she responded, as if some part of her too had been waiting for him. Grace stepped beside Dan, holding a bowl of cut fruit. She leaned on the doorframe and smiled. "They've figured each other out," she said. "They have. Better than most adults." Dan chuckled. "Don't I know it?" She paused, then turned to him. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop." "What do you mean, this piece, this house, the way it feels? It doesn't make sense to me. I spent so long running from a life that wasn't mine. I don't quite know what to do with one that fits." Dan took a slow sip from his mug. "Maybe it doesn't have to make sense. Maybe it just has to be." She studied him for a moment, her eyes soft, searching. "Do you ever stop saying exactly the right thing?" He gave a wry grin. "Only when I don't realize I'm saying it." That afternoon, the four of them piled into Dan's beat-up Ford, Ellie and Leo in the back, chattering about fall leaves and apple cider. Grace riding shotgun with a thermos of hot cocoa between her knees. They were headed to the town's autumn harvest festival, something Dan used to avoid. Too many people. Too many reminders of the life he'd once had and lost. But this year was different. They arrived to pumpkin-lined walkways and music drifting from a folk band by the gazebo. Booths lined the square, homemade crafts, pumpkin pies, jars of honey with labels handwritten by second graders. Children darted between hay bales while parents sipped cider and swapped recipes. Grace took Leo's hand. Dan held Ellie's, and for a moment it looked like they had been doing this for years. "Let's do the corn maze," Ellie cried. "Only if you're leading," Dan replied. "Deal." They wandered together, laughter bouncing off the stalks. Dan took a wrong turn and blamed a squirrel. Grace accused him of sabotage. Ellie declared herself the official navigator and got them out in 15 minutes triumphant. Afterward, they shared a funnel cake, powdered sugar coating everyone's fingers and Leo's nose. Grace offered napkins, but Dan simply wiped his thumb across Leo's cheek and smiled. Leo leaned into him without hesitation. It was such a small moment, quick, easy, natural. But Grace saw it. She caught Dan's eye and held it. Not with surprise, with gratitude. Leo wasn't just safe here, he belonged. As dusk settled, the four of them sat on a bale of hay, watching the town's annual lantern lighting ceremony. Hundreds of paper lanterns glowing with soft golden light were passed from hand to hand. One by one, they rose into the cooling sky, drifting upward like soft-voiced prayers. Ellie clutched her lantern tight. "Can we write something on it?" Dan nodded. "If you want." She bent over with her marker tongue between her teeth, writing carefully. Then she passed it to Leo. He stared at the blank side for a long time. "Can I write thank you?" he asked quietly. Dan's throat tightened. "Yeah, buddy, that's perfect." When their lantern finally lifted into the sky, Dan watched it rise higher than the others. Maybe it was the angle. Maybe it was the timing. Or maybe some things were just meant to stand out. On the walk back to the truck, Grace slipped her hand into Dan's. He didn't say a word. Neither did she. But it was the first time she'd reached for him voluntarily, not out of fear or instinct, but something deeper. It wasn't romance. Not yet. It was something more honest trust. That night back at the house, Ellie and Leo fell asleep watching a movie on the living room floor. Grace covered them with a blanket, tucking the edges in carefully. Dan stood in the doorway watching her. "You're good with them," he said. "I love them both," she replied, brushing hair from Leo's forehead. "And I trust you with him. That's not something I've said about anyone in a long time." Dan stepped into the room, voice low. "What made you come back?" Grace looked up at him, eyes tired but clear. "Because every place I ran to felt like escape. This was the first place that felt like home." He nodded, his voice rough. "Then stay. Not just for the night. Not just for the fall festival. Stay." She stood slowly, meeting his gaze. "Dan, I know we're not perfect, but we're trying. And sometimes trying is enough to build something real." Grace stepped closer. "I want Leo to grow up where kindness isn't just a story," she said. "Where people show up. Where porch lights mean something." Dan's hand found hers again. "Then let's build that," he said. "One day at a time." They stood in the glow of the fireplace, the soft crackle of embers filling the silence between them. And in the other room, two children slept safe, warm, wrapped in the kind of love no fortune could buy. A family not by blood, but by choice. The mornings in Millersville had turned crisp cold enough for breath to linger in the air, warm enough for sweaters instead of coats. The change in season was subtle, but Dan felt it in more than just the wind. He felt it in the way Grace stood closer to him in the kitchen, in how Leo reached for his hand now when they crossed the street, in the rhythm of 4 toothbrushes instead of 2 by the bathroom sink. They were becoming a family. But even the gentlest bonds require time to strengthen, and sometimes, just as something begins to settle, it trembles under the weight of old fears. It started on a Monday. Leo had a nightmare. Dan heard it before anyone else. The cry wasn't loud, it was strangled, panic, the kind of sound that came from deep inside a child who had learned to suffer quietly. Dan moved fast, crossing the hallway to the small guest room. Grace was already there, arms around her son, murmuring softly, "I'm here, baby. I'm here. You're safe." Leo's chest heaved, his eyes wide and unfocused. Dan crouched beside the bed. "Hey, Leo. It's okay. You're in your room. Nothing bad's here." The boy turned toward him, still shaking. He gripped Dan's shirt with trembling fingers, the way a child might cling to a lifeline. Dan didn't hesitate. He scooped him gently into his arms like he had with Ellie 1,000 times before. Grace followed them into the living room, where Dan settled into the worn armchair, with Leo curled against his chest. They sat in silence for several minutes, the fire in the hearth throwing soft orange light across the floor. "He was dreaming about the house," Grace whispered from the edge of the couch. "The old one. With my father." Dan's jaw tensed. Grace stared at the flames. "My father never hit him. He didn't have to. His expectations were like steel bars, always watching, always measuring. He used to talk about Leo like an asset, as if he were a company being groomed." Dan looked down at the boy, slowly relaxing in his arms, the tension fading from his shoulders, sleep tugging at him again. "No child should feel like they have to earn love," he said quietly. Grace's voice broke. "That's why I left. That's why I ran. You did the right thing." She nodded slowly, tears catching in her lashes. Later, after they tucked Leo back into bed, Grace lingered in the hallway. "I've been thinking," she said, "about staying." Dan turned toward her. "You are staying. I mean, really staying. Buying a place here, starting fresh, Enrolling Leo in school? Dan stepped closer. That sounds like something permanent. It is, she said, but it scares me. Why? Because what if I fail again? What if the people I'm trying to protect get hurt anyway? What if this, she gestured between them, is too fragile? Dan took her hand. Grace, nothing worth building is easy. But this isn't fragile. You're not alone this time. You don't have to carry everything by yourself. She didn't say anything, just leaned forward and rested her forehead against his chest. And Dan stood there holding her, letting the silence speak for them both. The next few days passed quietly. Grace visited the community center she was helping fund. Dan returned to the shop but kept his hours light, finding himself looking at the clock more often, wondering what Leo and Ellie were doing, whether Grace had eaten lunch, whether the house felt different without the hum of tools echoing through it. On Thursday evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, Dan came home to the smell of baked apples and cinnamon. Grace had tried a new recipe. One of the old women from the church had passed it along during the community potluck the week before. She wasn't a confident baker, but the smile she gave Dan as he walked in the door told him she had needed to try. The kids sat at the table, faces dusted with sugar, debating which superhero would be the best pie maker. Dan kissed Ellie's forehead, then turned to Leo. You look like someone who won a contest. Leo grinned. I ate too. Grace narrowed her eyes playfully. We're pretending it was just one. They all laughed, and Dan felt it again, that still golden sense of rightness, of place. But just as quickly something shifted. Leo froze mid-bite. His eyes darted to the window. Dan followed his gaze. A dark sedan had pulled up along the curb. Not one of the black SUVs, but sleek, clean, out of place in this town. Grace stiffened. Do you recognize it? Dan asked. She nodded. It's my father's driver. Dan stepped toward the door, but Grace grabbed his arm. Let me, she said, her voice steadier than he expected. She walked out onto the porch as the man in the suit stepped from the car. He was older than Dan, with silver hair and a familiar sort of stiffness in his spine, like a man who had spent his life being obeyed. He didn't smile. Miss Hathaway, Grace, she corrected. Your father requests a meeting. She folded her arms. He can make requests. I don't take orders anymore. There was a pause. Will you reconsider? He says the company is missing your voice. Then maybe it needs less noise. The man didn't react. He handed her an envelope and returned to the car. Grace stood there for a moment, the envelope clutched tightly in her hand. Then she dropped it into the mailbox unopened and walked back inside. Dan watched her carefully. You okay? She nodded. It's done. It has to be. Are you sure? Grace took his hand, fingers lacing through his. He had power over me because I was always chasing something, proving something. But I'm not chasing anymore. He brushed a strand of hair from her face. What are you doing instead? Choosing, she said, and I'm choosing this. Dan didn't need to say anything. He just held her hand and pulled her gently into the warmth of the house, where the scent of cinnamon lingered, and two children laughed without fear. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for the first time in years, that was more than enough. It was the first truly cold morning of November. Frost glazed the porch railings, turning every wooden slat silver under the rising sun. Dan stood outside, coffee mug in hand, watching his breath cloud in the air. He'd always loved this time of year before the snow fell, before the holidays swelled with their ache of memory. It was a quiet season, the space between, but today didn't feel quiet. He felt it before he saw it, a stillness, a tension in the house, like someone had exhaled and forgotten to breathe in again. Inside, Grace was folding laundry, but her movements were stiff, measured. Leo sat on the couch watching a cartoon, but his body was curled tight around the raccoon Ellie had given him, his eyes barely on the screen. Ellie, sensing something, the way only children do, had gone quiet too. Dan walked in slowly, setting the mug down. Something happened. Grace didn't look up. I got a letter, not from my father, from his attorney. Dan's pulse kicked up. What does it say? She set down a towel. He's filing for emergency visitation rights. With Leo. Dan blinked. What? Grace nodded. He claims I'm mentally unfit, that I've distanced my son from necessary care and family oversight. Dan stepped forward. That's Grace, that's a lie. I know, she said, voice tight. But he's powerful. And he knows how to make lies look like concern. Dan's fist clenched. You don't have to face this alone. I'm not, she said. Not anymore. But that doesn't make it less terrifying. She finally looked at him then, and he saw it, the fear she was trying so hard to hide. Not fear for herself, for Leo. I can fight this, she said. I will. But it means we'll be watched. There'll be home visits, interviews, maybe even a custody hearing. Dan didn't flinch. Then we'll clean the place up and answer their questions. You'd be okay with that, Grace. If I cared about appearances, I wouldn't be raising a 6-year-old in a house with a duct-taped coffee table. She gave a soft, broken laugh. I love that coffee table. He moved toward her, sliding his hand into hers. He won't win. Not this time. The next week was a blur. A social worker showed up unannounced one morning, clipboard in hand, eyes sharp but not unkind. She spoke to Grace, to Dan, to Ellie. She spent 30 quiet minutes with Leo, who said little but showed her his favorite book and the raccoon he slept with every night. After she left, Dan found Grace in the hallway, hands trembling. She asked me if I had a support system, she whispered. I almost laughed. 6 months ago I didn't. And now I do. He didn't say anything, just wrapped his arms around her and held her there steady as the ground she stood on. A week later, they received notice of a formal custody review. The court date was set 3 weeks out. Grace didn't cry, but she stopped sleeping. Dan noticed her awake at 2 a.m., curled on the couch, staring out the window like she was waiting for something, some answer that hadn't yet arrived. Talk to me, he said gently one night. She didn't turn to him. I keep thinking, what if I lose him? What if they decide I'm too unstable, too impulsive? What if all the running I did becomes proof I shouldn't have him? Grace, she turned, eyes full of quiet panic. I've seen mothers walk away, he said. You didn't. You ran toward something better, toward safety, toward him. She shook her head. But what if that's not enough? Dan moved to the couch, sat beside her. Then we show them what is. The love in this house. The joy. The routine. The way Ellie and Leo read to each other. The fact that the raccoon has its own toothbrush. We show them this life. Grace looked at him. You really believe we can win? He nodded. I believe you've already won. The rest is just convincing them. A few days before the hearing, a letter arrived. Not official, personal, handwritten. Dan brought it in with the mail and placed it in Grace's hand. She opened it slowly, then stared at the contents for a long time. He waited. It's from my brother, she said finally. Andrew. Dan remembered the name, the one who had taken over the company, the one who'd always played by their father's rules. He says he wants to testify. For me. Dan's brows lifted. That's unexpected. Grace smiled faintly. Not entirely. Andrew was always loyal, but not heartless. She folded the letter carefully. He says our father has crossed a line, that he wants no part in punishing me for leaving. Dan placed a hand on her shoulder. That changes everything. Grace nodded slowly. Yes, it does. That night after dinner, Grace took Leo outside with a lantern and 2 small candles. The stars were out bright and wide, and the wind was gentle for once. Ellie ran ahead, showing Leo how to balance the candle without letting the flame flicker out. Dan watched from the porch, arms crossed, heart so full it ached. Grace came up beside him. He's smiling again. Dan nodded. He looks like a kid, not an heir. She laughed softly. Exactly. They stood together, watching their children light up the night. And in that moment, Dan realized something. This wasn't just a home. It was a haven. A quiet fortress built not with stone or wealth, but with kindness, with presence, with trust. And tomorrow, when they walked into that courtroom, they wouldn't walk in broken. They would walk in whole, together. It was still dark when Dan woke on the morning of the hearing. The house was quiet, not with tension, but with intention. The kind of silence that settled in just before something important, something life-changing, the way snow quiets the earth before the first light breaks through. Dan sat on the edge of the bed, feet touching the cold floor. He didn't rush. He let the moment sink in. Today they would walk into a courtroom. They would speak, answer questions, and hand over their hearts to a system that didn't always see hearts. But they wouldn't walk in alone. When he entered the kitchen, Grace was already there, hair brushed, smooth, eyes soft but determined. She wore a simple navy dress, nothing flashy. Just enough to say, I'm steady. I'm ready. Dan offered her a mug of coffee. She took it with both hands, their fingers brushing. They didn't speak much over breakfast. Ellie helped Leo with his socks. Dan straightened Leo's collar. Grace packed tissues just in case. At 8:00 a.m., they walked out the door together. The courthouse was small, just a few brick rooms and a second-floor courtroom that smelled faintly of paper and old wood. The bench was polished but worn like everything in Millersville, modest, honest, used. Leo gripped Grace's hand. Ellie sat beside him in a navy cardigan and purple headband, clutching her sketchbook to her chest. Dan stood tall, the calm center of it all, his presence anchoring the space between them. When Grace was called, she stood without trembling. Her voice, though soft, did not waver. She told the judge about the fear, the running the moment Leo twisted his ankle in the woods, and how they ended up on Dan's porch cold, desperate, and without expectation. "I thought no one would open the door," she said. "But he did. And he didn't ask for explanations. He just helped." She paused. "And when I left, I realized I'd left the first real home Leo had ever known." Dan watched her closely. Every word she said she'd lived. That was the power in her voice. It wasn't a performance. It was the truth, unvarnished and brave. Then Andrew spoke. Grace's brother suit and all but softer than Dan expected. He spoke clearly, their father's influence, his manipulation and the way he used control in place of care. "My sister, Andrew said, has done more for Leo, with less than our father ever did with everything." Dan was next. He hadn't prepared a speech. He wasn't the speech-making type. So he just told the story. About the knock on a cold night. About a frightened boy and a mother who wouldn't let go. About how sometimes doing the right thing wasn't about fixing something. It was just about staying when someone needed you. He looked at the judge. "I'm not Leo's blood, but I'd show up for him every day of my life. And I know Grace would too." The judge didn't speak for a long time after the testimony ended. He looked over paperwork, then at the people before him. Not a headline family, not a scandal. Just 4 people trying to become something whole. At last he said, "Petition for sole custody is granted to Ms. Grace Hathaway. Visitation by the grandfather is denied on the grounds of demonstrated emotional harm and control." And just like that, it was done. They didn't cry until they reached the parking lot. Grace stood under the wide gray sky, arms wrapped tight around Leo as tears slipped down her cheeks. Dan pulled Ellie close, his hand resting on Grace's back. "I thought I'd feel relief," she whispered. "But this feels like something else." Dan tilted his head. "What a beginning." He smiled. "That's exactly what it is." 2 weeks later, they held a small party in the backyard. Nothing big, just neighbors. A few families from the community center, and Mabel from the library, who insisted on bringing homemade lemon squares, even though no one really liked lemon squares. The kids strung paper lanterns across the fence, and Dan grilled on the porch while Grace poured cider into mismatched mugs. Laughter filled the air like music, and for the first time in a long time, there was no weight hanging between their shoulders. Grace stood beside him, her hand brushing his as she passed him a plate. "You still keep that porch light on?" she asked, teasing. "Always," Dan replied, "just in case." She smiled. "Good." They didn't need to say what came next. It was already unfolding. That night, long after the last guest left and the kids had fallen asleep under a blanket fort in the living room, Dan and Grace sat on the porch swing. The moon was high, the wind quiet. "Do you ever think," she began, "how different everything would have been if you hadn't opened the door that night?" He nodded. "All the time." Grace turned to him. "Why did you?" Dan thought for a long second, then looked at her with a quiet smile. "Because you knocked." She laughed low and warm and leaned her head on his shoulder. They rocked in silence for a while, the porch light glowing above them. And as the night deepened and the stars pressed gently overhead, Dan realized something that surprised him. He wasn't just grateful that Grace had come back. He was grateful that somewhere deep in her heart, she'd believed someone like him would care enough to answer. In a quiet town with a house full of warmth, the light stayed on. Not because someone was lost, but because at last they were home. We'd love to hear from you. Where in the world are you watching from? Drop a comment below and let us know. Your stories and thoughts mean so much to us. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We share more stories just like this, full of hope, healing, and the quiet strength of everyday people. Thank you for watching and spending your time with us today. Until next time, stay kind, stay hopeful, and keep the porch light on for someone who might need it.